Hello and welcome. My name is Adam Koplan. I'm the artistic director of the Flying Carpet Theater Company. And we, for the last couple of months, have been hosting a podcast on family history. I am working with a co-host, Pete Candler, and each episode we chat with somebody who has done a bunch of research about their family history and often have come up with some surprises, some unexpected twists. And we're also trying to make sure we speak with people who have totally different backgrounds one from the next and hear about histories that we wouldn't otherwise have gotten a chance to know about. Tonight, we're very privileged to be able to chat with Eric Behrens. Eric and I go way back. We went to college together, and Eric professionally is an expert in something that I think most people would be very jealous about in this day and age. He's an expert in the intersection of technology and education, which is a very hot topic at the moment. Eric has a series of discoveries and ancestors that he's going to get a chance to tell us about, and I can't wait. I also think that a big topic for this evening that I'm also very excited about is going to be the intergenerational transmission. What histories do we choose to share with our kids? Why do we choose to share those histories? So that's going to be a big topic this evening. Welcome, Eric. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Pete, any words before we get going?
No, let's do it.
Let's dive in.
Yeah.
So, Eric, we start off with a very general question, which is we'd love for you to tell us about an ancestor that you've learned about that you think we would find especially interesting.
Well, the one that I always start with, that because it connects with American history, is that I do have an ancestor who fought in the Revolutionary War, except he fought on the other side. So my nth great-grandfather, my fifth great-grandfather, Johann Nicholas Bonner, who was an ancestor on my father's side, was a Hessian soldier who came from the Palatinate in Germany and was either conscripted or a mercenary, depending on which version of history you want to go with, and fought for Colonel Rahl, who fought initially in the battles in New York in the early part of the Revolutionary War. And so he was part of a successful campaign in his first combat in the colonies during the Revolution. And then Johann Nicholas Bonner was one of the Hessians that were famously captured at the Battle of Trenton on Christmas night, 1776. So if you remember that picture of George Washington on the boat that everybody, that iconic picture. So that was them crossing the river into Trenton that night and capturing about almost 1,000 Hessian soldiers who then became prisoners of war. And my ancestor was one of those captured. And then, the interesting thing is that in sort of tracing the history of that, the people who've really looked into this have, found, you just find little nibbles of history of where he pops up again. So, we know that he was documented among the captured as part of Rahl's regiment. And then it is implied that he had been shipped with the other prisoners out to Lancaster County, which is where the colonists, the Continental Army didn't really have a means for really having to provide for all these prisoners. So what they did with these German prisoners was sent them out to Lancaster County, where there were a lot of Germans already living, and they basically became indentured servants. They worked on the farms out there. And they were among people who could speak their language and who were benefiting from the labor of having these soldiers. And probably it was a better life than what he was experiencing on the front lines.
Eric, just to dive in here, there's a standard. We've spoken with a few people who have Revolutionary era ancestors, and they talk about it. And there's kind of a trope, as you know, of like, oh, my ancestor fought in this battle or what have you. You're the first person we've spoken with who has, somebody on the other side. And I'm wondering, as, in your family, was that like, as people would exchange stories about it, was that like something talked about with a chuckle and how contrarian you all are? Or, what was the kind of internal family narrative?
I think that was sort of, the way, I've even joked about, like with my kids, like, our ancestor fought on the wrong side of that battle. But it's also interesting because, it also reveals certain the myths of history. So, typically when we say Hessians, the first word that comes to mind is mercenaries. And while they may have been paid soldiers, they were probably also conscripted. So, they may not have entirely had choice. I can't say, right? The other thing is that I have read contradictory reports. The story about why the Hessians were so easily captured is that they were, on Christmas night, they were drunk and partying into the night, and that made it easy for them to be captured. But there are historians who've gone back and looked at that and said, actually, what was written at the time by the people in Washington's army was that, in fact, they were hungry, they were tired, they were certainly groggy, and they were caught by surprise, but they weren't reveling.
Right. Let's back up for a second. Is this something that you've known that your family had revolutionary roots all through growing up? Is this something you discovered through research, or?
Pardon me for dropping out of frame here for a second, but this is I can't claim to be some great genealogical historian here. This is a book. It's 400 pages long that documents his ancestors in Germany, going back several generations, and pretty much everybody that we know of that is descended from that person since that time. And it's called A Genealogy of Selected Northumberland County, Pennsylvania Pioneer Families, from the arrival of the immigrant ancestors to the present time. And this is, this is the third edition. There's been a fourth edition that's since come out. So every once in a while, some poor unlucky family member thinks that they're going to take this on as a project and goes around and traces down all these people who are in this book. I'm in this book. My brother is in this book. My kids are in this book. And it becomes a kind of living history document, so that at the very least you can kind of understand where all your ancestors are. And there have been, the original editions were really just chock full with a lot of lore that sounded like, there were, rumors of buried treasure and all kinds of things that pop up in that kind of family lore. But there were actually a few scholars who were among the family who, particularly when a historian who, once he retired from being a tenured professor, he kind of spent a lot of his time going back and looking at primary sources to sort of figure out what was actually factually documented. And so, we do have some of those earlier versions of the history, but then we actually have a version that tries to account for what is known.
Is there a counter narrative about, given how mythological the revolution is in American history, and sort of, what it meant for, all the people who fought and their spirit of 76 and that sort of a thing? Within your own family, was there some sort of counter narrative about what the revolution meant or anything like that, or even what it meant to be a German American at that time?
Yeah, and I don't know how to answer that, especially because German American, means so many different things at different times. We're of a generation where German might have, connoted things that were more associated with the 20th century Germany. I know it was always a point of pride, and it was discussed because, basically, these ancestors, this family, extended family, all lived, for the most part, still, within 100 miles of this ancestral home. So we all grew up in Dauphin County, Lancaster County, Lebanon County, Northumberland County, Pennsylvania. And so, kind of stick there. You go land there in the 1700s and never leave. And so you can go to cemeteries and just visit A single cemetery in Pillow, Pennsylvania, the Union Cemetery. I could probably walk in there and half the people in that cemetery are ancestors of mine. I can see generation after generation. I don't know that there'd be a counter narrative. I don't think it was that. I just don't think we thought that much about the revolution. And part of his story, actually, it's interesting. So not only was he captured, but then he was part of a prisoner exchange where he was sent back into service. And then the next time he surfaces is a record of him going AWOL in Savannah, Georgia, where he was stationed along a road, a supply route in Savannah. And one night, he and 4 of his mates were listed as having gone basically AWOL and having taken their packs with them. And 4 of them went, my ancestor included, and 2 of them were captured and then hung for abandoning their post. The other 2 escaped and were just presumed gone and never found. And at that point, the trail drops off until years after the war in 1782, he shows up back in Pennsylvania again, paying taxes on a cow. So there's this, this fascinating gap in history where you can imagine all kinds of things that happened. There are probably only 2 or 3 likely scenarios of how that transition happened, but it's still fascinating to just understand, like, I don't think this guy wanted to be in the war. I don't think he was ever happy. He wanted, but it's also interesting that what he did was end up with land a few years after the revolution, which suggests to me, I have always assumed, and it's one of the possible accounts, is that there were flyers at the time telling the Hessians in German that the Continental Army would, if they took an oath of loyalty, would give them land. They're trying to undermine the British Army by trying to, take the Hessians out of play, or sort of at least undermine their morale. And because he had actually a pretty large swath of land right after the war without a lot of intervening time, it's quite possible he fled to the colonial lines and the Continental Army lines and took them up on their deal. Either that, or he was able to use a network of German speakers and somehow get back there and ingratiate himself into a family. He did get married pretty quickly and started a family and basically lived the life of a farmer for the rest of his life.
This may go a little broad at this early in the evening, but I'm fascinated by this story because it's connected to not just family myths that you've kind of grown up with and inherited, but also national myths. Mm-hmm. And I mean, when you mention Washington crossing the Delaware, like, everybody can visualize that painting. Like, yeah, virtually everybody knows what you're talking about. Can see it. Yep. We've all grown up with this mythology of Washington on the bow of the ship, sort of. Yes. So my question is kind of a little bit whimsical, but I think it touches on something we can talk more about. Knowing what you know now in kind of granular detail, more about the circumstances of that night, do you think Washington actually looked like that when he was crossing the Delaware?
I'm certain he didn't. I bet you. So first of all, you wouldn't want your general standing out looking like a big target, right? Like, first rule of warfare. Like, the general stays on in the backward ranks. But yeah, no, that's a complete mythology. I'm sure he was seated. I'm sure he was cloaked, right? Like, I'm sure of it. And I haven't really read the history of the making of that painting, but so many of the things from that revolutionary period are not actually, that painting is not from the period. That painting is probably from the 19th century, and it's part of the national myth making that, it ends up on all of our history textbooks, but it's not a good historical document per se.
It also makes me think a little bit about, that there are, we see that painting in the history textbook. We get a sense of who came, there's kind of a myth of the sort of white Mayflower generation, and that they fought hard, or not generation, but that kind of, that Anglo type of American yeoman farmer that's on the land, and they work hard. They're in the Americas for a couple of generations, and then they fight for freedom, and we all sort of receive that. And it's not something we learn about much, that there were other European ethnicities kind of coming and populating America from a lot of different pathways, even during the revolutionary generation and around there. So to me, it also goes to show sort of some of the limitations of our general myths around what that era of America looked like.
I'm pretty sure that the history of the period is that there were almost as many German speakers as English speakers in the colonies around that time, and certainly in Pennsylvania that would have totally been true. Like Philadelphia was sort of an enclave of the Quakers from England, and west of Philadelphia, that's where the Mennonites and the Amish had settled, and so honestly, the country was probably very, particularly the northern colonies were very dependent upon agriculture that was coming from those places, right? And I think there's even a quote from Franklin about sort of like, his sort of mocking the Germans because of how ignorant and brutish they were, but like sort of like they were useful because they were, they took care of the animals.
In terms of your extended family, how much of it hails from German ancestry?
Well, on my father's side, it almost exclusively from German ancestry. I mean, the reality is that given that they were in kind of remote rural places, and they stayed in those places for all of the generations up to including my father's generation, it's just all German families sort of intermingling, right? And Johann Nicholas Bonner, to be perfectly honest, is at least twice and maybe more times one of my direct ancestors because of cousin marriages or second or third cousin marriages. So it's pretty much all German heritage on my father's side. My mother's side is a little bit more mixed, and it kind of connects up to one of the things you just said about sort of like the other narratives of early American, even European arrivers, immigrators, because a lot of that history, particularly in Pennsylvania, is religious related, because of William Penn specifically and his vision of Pennsylvania. On my mother's side, there is a strong strain of this sort of German, more Swiss Mennonite heritage, but one of her parents was a British descent and had married into a French Canadian family. So things get a little bit more diversified across the continent of Europe on that side.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we sort of leave this Hessian, remind me this Hessian fellow's name again?
Johann Nicholas Bonner.
Johann Nicholas Bonner. So before we leave Johann Nicholas Bonner, in terms of, so you guys can trace your family lineage back to a key moment in our national heritage. I'm wondering, in some larger sense, what has that meant for you, and what has it meant for your family, if anything?
I can't speak for the rest of my family, but I do know that there was a deep sense among my extended family, particularly the people who've passed along this history to me, of this connection to Pennsylvania, a connection to place, a connection to religion, and a kind of pride that really had nothing to do with the revolution. It just had to do with knowing the story of this huge family, and all of its many parts. The reality is that partially because of this book, it was easy to organize reunions, and so people gathered and would sort of say which of Johann Nicholas's 4 children are you descended from? And, kind of share the parts of the story that they knew, the sort of fabric of that sort of that American story and that very Pennsylvania oriented story. But it was just, I think that there was a kind of respect for, that side of the family. There's a lot of like history hoarders. There are a lot of people who like kept all the letters from somebody, and a lot of, have all the scrapbooks and old newspaper clippings of marriages and speeches that somebody made. And so there was actually a lot of, and people were always handing this to me. Like I would go to Thanksgiving at my dad's cousin's house, and she would have already found 5 things she wanted to give to me. And I'm like a 14-year-old kid at this point. And, and I would spend the rest of the after Thanksgiving dinner, having her show me what they found of her going through her father's papers and things that he had saved that had been given to him by, his relatives or things he had found. And so it was just always part of the conversation. Our family connection as an extended family was very profound. It was just always present.
First things first, just as a small technical thing, I'm hearing some little audio pops. Are you guys hearing those? Sort of sounds a little bit like keystrokes or something like that. If it may be one of you's moving around or something like that, I just want to see if either of you are aware of it.
It could be that my microphone is on my shirt, and like as I'm bopping my head a little bit, it's kind of scratching.
Okay, that could be.
Try to be a little bit calmer.
Right. Keep all that energy into the voice, I suppose. One of the things that you said, Eric, that resonates really powerfully with me and I think is a theme that's emerging. Pete and I both have our own sort of different narratives around family amnesia and its taxes. And in my own family, you'd be lucky if any of us knew even the names of the great-grandparents. You know what I mean? And so part of what you're saying is that the family knew that who the people were and what their connection to the place was a sense of rooting and pride, is something that I think people who don't have that can especially understand or cotton to. It's been one of the things that may have even driven some of my own looking, because I guess I never had that.
Mm-hmm. No,
yeah, that's true for me too. Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this idea of like, your whole family, your uncles and whatever, sort of passing these documents on to you, and like at family gatherings. I mean, the idea of a family gathering that would never happen in my family, like it never has.
Yeah.
Certainly around like extended family anyway, and around the idea of a common ancestor or something.
It's interesting that you say that though, because I hadn't thought about this until this morning as I was thinking about this conversation. My father was an orphan at age 10. And my mother lost her mother when she was a young child as well, while she was elementary school age. So I have 3 grandparents who were long dead at the time I was born. I had one grandfather who lived until I was 6. And so it's interesting because these people only existed as stories for me, but as memories being shared with me by a generation of people who knew that our connections to them were very fragile, that they were almost on verge of being severed. And I think that they didn't want to lose them. And that's why it was for them so important to share them with me. And also the feeling that maybe I would miss out. I think that one of the reasons, I was a bookish kid, so I would be the kind of kid that they would say, oh, that kid he'll read this stuff. But on top of that, I think that they were thinking that, you're never going to know your grandmother or grandfather. You don't know the stories. But some of them, particularly my dad's cousin, Becky, wanted to share with me what she had met. She knew my my grandmother and my grandfather. She knew my great grandparents as a child, so she could tell me about them, and she wanted to remember them, and she wanted to share them. And so it was as much about my relationship with Becky as it was about her, her desire to pass things to me, and also that it also explains why we were so close, because my dad did not having his parents to raise him. My uncle Ralph, Becky's father, was actually his legal guardian for the rest of his childhood. And so Uncle Ralph was kind of like a stand-in, a surrogate grandfather for me. Mm. So I hear what you're saying, but I think it was sort of like a fight against the amnesia, a fight against the loss that was a part of at least the story for me and my immediate family.
I have a similar book to the one that you held up a minute ago. In fact, when I had to dash out of frame myself, I went to look for it. I can't find it right this minute. But it's about and I'm thinking of this both because it's about a Revolutionary War. I mean, he's the central character, as it were. It's titled after him, who fought near Johann in near Savannah. So they may have crossed paths at some point. But the circumstances that led to the compilation of that little book were, I think, because the author, who would have been like my great grandfather's first cousin, and most of the family grew up in Atlanta, but he grew up in Gainesville and kind of with this separate wing. And at a time when the Atlanta crew was becoming really involved in sort of Atlanta culture and everything. And I feel a part of me suspects that he felt a sort of sense of kind of alienation almost. He was also living in DC at the time. He was a congressman, so he went to the Library of Congress after work, I guess, and just pored over the archives there. But it's interesting, like, what is it that prompts someone to seek after this stuff? It seems like and in your case, it seems like we've heard this over and over again, and this fear of something getting lost, or this concern that if you don't like hand deliver it to you, there's a danger that all of this will be lost. And sometimes that originates in I found this story about was it your father who was an orphan?
Yes.
Right. That sense of there being an absence there, and trying to fill that in some way with a personage that's constructed from memory or from stories, to me is really fascinating.
The interesting thing, though, is that my father wasn't the one who was generally passing along these stories to me. Like, I think he was interested in it and he found it kind of curious, but the other relatives actually zoomed in on me, and this started to happen on my mother's side as well. That I started to show an interest in, so people would be going through their drawers and pulling out things and sending them along. And every once in a while I get a little packet or an envelope of photographs that people had put up some notes on the back of them about what they were, who they were. And so, yeah, it's interesting because I don't, my father himself is deceased, so I can't go back and ask him about these things now. But I don't know whether how he processed that, and whether he avoided some of it and allowed it to be my thing because it brought up pain for him.
Obviously the most iconic image in family history is the tree, right? And the constant language is the sort of roots, right? And there's something about, in your case, these incredibly deep roots in a particular place, and then on top of that, the ability to look even deeper to find sort of roots around that in another country. And then, but there's also this very poignant, powerful trigger of the tree being disrupted in a way, and that there's this one push for things that root you, and an awareness of some key parts of the trunk that were not there at that moment. That's we haven't heard that before.
Yeah, it's also interesting because in the 17th and 18th centuries, there are of course notable exceptions, but a lot of my ancestors lived to ripe old ages. Especially for the time period. But I had in the late 1800s relatives who lived into their 80s. And and had their lived to see all their grandchildren, and I think one of them even made it to his 90s. And in the 20th century, however, there have been a lot of early losses. My father lost his father when he was 4, his mother when he was 10. My mother lost her mother to a cancer that at the time was untreatable, but also at other places in the family tree, there are like a lot of these little disruptions. And even my own father, is because he died when he was in his mid-60s, he only met one of my 3 children. Well, no, I should say he held my infant second child shortly before he died, suddenly. And so, there are these sort of like this fear of, or the sense of like, life is tenuous. There are, that there are losses you can lose this history.
Can we jump to either a different side of the family or a different ancestor that in some way is a interesting distinction or a kind of a counter to Johann?
Well, yeah, I don't know how the counters happen. It's not like I have this, like the side of the family where we had the cat burglar or something like that.
Right.
But I will jump over to my mother's side, and I wanted to mention a couple of the anecdotes that my mother shared about my great-grandfather, William Bean Shope. So, and it's interesting to note that William was a descendant of Hans Herr. So in talking about this great Pennsylvania history, Hans Herr was the first Mennonite bishop to immigrate to America. He was invited by William Penn to settle. He's settled in Lancaster County, and there's a tourist location, a historical tourism location, where you can go to the Hans Herr house. And so that side of the family is deeply connected to this very rich Church of the Brethren and Mennonite community. And in fact, my own great-great-grandfather was a Mennonite bishop. And when we say a Mennonite bishop is not like when we think of a Catholic bishop. They really are the head of a meeting of a church.
I'm sorry to interrupt here, Eric, but for anybody who has really no context for who Mennonites are and how they got to the U.S., can you give us just a very brief overview of who the Mennonites are and what that looks like in Pennsylvania?
Yeah. Well, so a lot of people have at least some kind of image of who the Amish are, at least from public media or from media, from popular culture, and the Amish were actually part of a schism from the original Mennonites. They followed the teachings of a religious leader named, I believe, and boy, I really don't like to make historical mistakes, but I believe it's Joseph Menon. But they developed this much more kind of conservative, deep Protestant faith. It's very significantly one of the Protestant traditions that was, grew out of the Reformation. And they were plain people. They believed in not living ostentatiously, and very, very deep Bible-based faith.
But
German speakers, when we talk about the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect, they were the people who brought us the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect.
And the Mennonites are historically pacifists too.
Yes.
So
persecuted in Europe.
And persecuted by almost everybody in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's so interesting that you've got, on the one hand, this lineage that descends from a German soldier fighting for the British Army in the colonies, and then on the other, a tradition that descends, or a lineage that descends from pacifist Mennonites, which it's imagining the way those two come together.
Well, they come together in Pennsylvania. I mean, that really is, in its own weird way, that is a very Pennsylvania story.
Yeah.
And again, as you continue to, we'll get to the actual story about your ancestors, but growing up, were you around, in terms of people of deep faith who are deeply connected, and you could, to this long Mennonite tradition, and you're looking around and you're seeing the kind of culture in action?
Well, so you would certainly know people who are Mennonites and people who are Amish. Not so much right around the area where my brother and I grew up. My brother's actually tuning in here, so hi, Andre. But extended relatives who lived more out in Lebanon and Lancaster counties, but just a little bit west of where we grew up. Certainly, there, you would get behind the horse and buggy of an Amish family, and there, there's a lot of that presence that you would just see. So the interesting thing is that the story I was going to tell about William Bean is that, so here's William Bean, himself the grandson of a Mennonite bishop, and William was the one who left practicing Mennonites, and it's why I don't have a connection personally to that faith, which is that William wanted to marry Pearl Hanshaw. But Pearl Hanshaw was Lutheran, and Pearl Hanshaw was not interested in becoming a Mennonite wife and living that lifestyle. And so she made it clear that she would be happy to accept his hand in marriage, but they would become Lutherans. He would become a Lutheran and be a Lutheran with her, which I don't know exactly how that discussion played out. That part is not privy to me. I'm not privy to that part of the conversation, but he did. And so the identity that I have, from growing up, the church I grew up in a very religious family, was a Lutheran family, which is, German Lutherans in Pennsylvania is another strong, German American tradition. And it was also that the commitment to Lutheranism was actually very strong in the family to my mother, who made the same requirement of my father to get married. It's like he was generally Christian, but I don't think he had a sectarian connection that was really deep. And so, I don't think it was a hard decision for him to make. He didn't have adult parents that, to differ with him in any way. But so we grew up in a Lutheran household. And it is because of that decision, to know that's the pinpoint moment when the Mennonite in the traditions in the family ended, and it was because of love. And the other story that I like to share, because it's one that my mother always felt was very important to share with me, was that William was near death, very ill at the time when my mother was pregnant, and she grew up just on the same street as her grandfather. So she grew up close to him, and he kept telling her, "Don't worry, honey, I'm going to make it. I'm going to live because I'm going to hold this grandson of mine." And she said she wasn't sure if he was going to make it, but he was always very firm. He never had any doubt at least how he expressed it to him. And sure enough, I was born in May 11th. And when they got to bring me home, and, he held me in his arms, and I have a picture of being held in his arms. And days after that, is when he passed away. So, it is a kind of, you know, I'm not one to kind of like often think magically, like that one just sort of like magically has the ability to make oneself live, or to determine the moment of your death. But it is a powerful story of love. That is the kind of thing that we share in families. That when we want to show somebody you were loved, even though you don't know this person, you were important to this person. And it's obviously the kind of thing, and I'm getting a little, little verklempt here, but it's obviously the kind of thing that matters a lot, especially hearing that as a child.
Yeah, I got a little glassy myself hearing that, because I one of the things I love about what you're saying, Eric, is in a way the two stories you've told, one connects you to a place in this very deep way and connects you to this long history, and the other really, like, is in a sense curated to be about the loving connections that people have for each other, and how our lives, I mean, again, to get a little goofy here, but our lives are guided partially by circumstances of time and place, but also by these choices that people make. And one of the choices in family histories that you can't escape, there's a lot of often unsavory stuff, but one thing that is a really common theme is also love and choice around love. And so it's really beautiful to hear you talk about those things too. Can we, do you get a sense, one of the things, you've kind of given us some broad outline points, and then a couple of little specifics about your ancestors. Do you have any either mementos, little mini anecdotes, or things that you think might capture their personalities in some way, that like just something that our listeners would be like, oh yeah, I can picture that person a little bit in some way?
I have just the pictures of William when he was an old man sitting in a rocking chair, right, with white hair. And I really don't know him. I knew a little bit of his children. My grandfather, who I knew until he was 6, and his brother Mel, who had a little cattle ranch just down the road. But I don't have that kind of depth. But if you want to get to a historical figure where I do actually have a sense, even though I didn't know them, I have a real sense of the personality, we should go to a third.
Please.
A third ancestor. This is a good segue.
Yep.
So if we still have the time for that. So
definitely.
The person I wanted to tell you about, we're going to go back to my father's side, and we're actually going to go back to, not a direct descendant, but somebody who married into Johann Nicholas Bonner's family at a later date. So it's now the right around the 1898, 1899, and my great grandfather, who is Jonathan Elmer Bonner, is at the seminary at what is now Albright College in central Pennsylvania. And at the time it was in Boyerton, now it's in Reading, Pennsylvania. And that is where, going to the normal school that was there, he met my great grandmother. And the story that my cousin Becky previously mentioned had always told was that, and the way they talked to her is that she went there to go to school next to the seminary because she was quite determined to marry a pastor. She was herself extremely religious, and her vision for her life was to be married to a minister. So she found.
You don't hear that every day. Just
not anymore.
Yeah.
So she went to school there, and then when she left, she became a school teacher. And she was a school teacher at a one-room schoolhouse, far enough away that they had to correspond primarily through letters. So their courtship, until through the point where they got married, was all in letters. And so what I have is all the letters she wrote to him, because he kept those letters. Jonathan Elmer Bonner kept letters from his future wife, and he kept them his whole life, and they were in a box. And when he died, and then when Mary, his wife, died, Uncle Ralph kept them in the box. And the story is that he never opened them, that he felt like it was invading on, he was a very sweet man. He felt like it was invading on their privacy and that it contained things that were sacred between a married couple that you shouldn't read. I had no such hesitation. I didn't know them. And I became very fascinated with these because I heard her voice loud and clear. You know, she's writing sometimes 2 and 3 times a week to him. This is how they're carrying out their long distance relationship. And a lot of it is religious musings and her asking him for his questions about scripture. There's also a lot of social history in this, and family history, because she's talking about what's going on between her and her sister, or what her parents are saying, or what happened who she ran into at the train station, and what happened at the schoolhouse. You know, I learned that the way that they lit fires was using the old dry corn cobs that the farmers provided to them from their feed, and that when they ran out one time during the middle of a blizzard, she had to send one of the children out to the farmer right down the road to go get more corn cobs to help them start the fire back up. So that's the kind of thing you learn. She was quite stern, very opinionated. You would say that she was feminist of a certain ilk, and she was very firm-handed. And the thing I want to share with you, I have the whole stack of letters over here, but I have one of the letters here with me. And if I could, I'd actually like to read this letter. And the circumstance is they had just gotten married. And after they got married, he was immediately going to go become the minister for a church. And they were not together. She went back to her family home in Dauphin, Pennsylvania, and was waiting for him to send word that he had gotten a house for them to live in, so that she could come and rejoin her husband. This is, imagine being newlyweds. And this is the letter that she's sending. It's like, my dear husband, what I'm going to do now, I was hoping I would not have to do for a long time. That is, write a letter to my husband. If you would come to Dauphin, you would find a very disappointed wife. So you had better stay away until I am somewhat over this. Your letter yesterday morning was certainly disappointing enough. But then when this one came today, I was just as discouraged with the whole affair. So I'll skip a little bit here to sort of say, I'm sorry, I know my letter will disappoint you, since you want me to come to Boyertown under these conditions. I think I told you I would not come to Boyertown until we had a home. I do not have any desire to come and stay with any of our members, and I know we cannot afford the expense of my boarding. So I will stay where I am for the present, and if you are sure of a home, I can come to Boyertown anytime next week. I want to know by Saturday evening what I am to do about shipping the things from here. So, and the other charming part of this is that I have this little slip of paper that was also included in the envelope, and this is the only time there's like a little bonus, and I'm just going to read it to you. It's her shopping list. She wanted a wash boiler, a tea kettle made of nickel, a coal bucket and shovel, and a dish pan. So not only was he to get there was another part of the letter where she told him to get a bed set as well. So, but this was what she needed for her kitchen. And
what year do you reckon this was?
Oh, I know, it was 1902. It was April of 1902.
At first, it seemed a little bit sort of flirty, almost. Like,
I'm sure it was a little.
But I can't. But by the end, it was like, I am pissed. You know.
Yeah. And that was part of her tone, is that she was constantly deferential to him as a minister, which something that she revered. His piety was something that she admired, and she really did want to know what he thought about Scripture. But there was another level on which, she always called him my Elmer, not Jonathan, my Elmer, where, she was a little bit scolding, and she was clearly putting her foot down about sort of saying, domestically, I'm in charge here, and you have no idea what you're doing.
Yeah. It makes you realize that, you can do all this research on DNA and family tree and and all of that stuff. But when you have letters like that, you've really got something very special, because there's no other way you would have been able to determine that side of the two of them.
Yep.
I mean, it's like a really, it just humanizes it in such a way which makes it feel like I'm feeling myself get almost, I was going to say tingly, but that doesn't sound like a very nice word. But with, excited about this idea of going back to the fear of getting lost. I mean, how just to think of the act of preserving those letters, and even all those tiny little decisions about, not wanting to touch them and open them because that felt like a violation, but in actuality was probably a great thing for preservation and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then what a gift to be able to stumble upon something like that, and then have that little shopping list fall out too. These little details that seem so inconsequential, but.
So in terms of my own genealogical research, I had originally been interested in sort of the traditional family tree investigations, of sort of like figuring out, how can I figure out exactly how many generations back I can go? But by this point, I had become, and given the rich amount, the rich body of primary source material that I was getting from my relatives, I was so much more interested. Like at some point, the people far, far ago become an abstraction. It's like, they're not real to me. It's just another name on a piece of paper. And why does anybody care? But understanding when you have an opportunity to really understand who somebody was and what they were about, it's so much more interesting, just intellectually interesting, not to mention sort of meaningful for understanding, the whys your family is the way it is. Like, she was something of a busybody. She was very stern. She was later in life, she was, I know she was the president of the county women's temperance union. So very driven by her kind of moral passion. And, the other story I'd always heard about her from relatives is like, you knew, even at this time, you did not drink in front of her. And you did not drink or talk about drinking at the pastor's house. And so all of their kids had this experience of sort of like, people always like putting on their best behavior whenever they were present, because they didn't want the word to get back that they were misbehaving or that they had been drinking, to parents. Like, they felt that they had, like, people kind of kept them separate because their parents were so stern and pious and possibly judgmental.
Can I ask you just a quick question about, the circling back to that image that you opened with about Johann being on the Pennsylvania side as Washington crossed the Delaware. And then
he was in New Jersey, yeah.
In New Jersey, excuse me. My geography is not so good, but and then this last piece about, your interest in these personal stories. How important is it to make that sort of connection when we're talking about American history and we tend to approach it with these big mythological figures in mind, and to tend to think of it as a series of actions by some great man? That's typically how I was taught history.
One of the reasons I found her interesting is because it's one of the rare times, particularly when you're studying genealogy, where you can really hear a woman's voice coming through in her own words.
Yeah.
And there's so much that is defined by the patriarchy that, that is a really important thing to me, is like to understand, the matriarch of a family, and her, her story and through her own words. But honestly, I've never been a person who's typically very interested in the great men theories of history. And while I'm aware of them and, certainly we're surrounded by them, I am so much more interested in hearing somebody's story about like, I'd much rather hear about your story, a person that I don't know, than to hear about,
Yeah.
a sort of abstracted, polished over, varnished version of, some story from long ago. And that's one of the things I discovered. But
I wonder, Eric, if that you've been able to have that point of view of long standing has something to do with this rich set of sense of place, all these data points. Like in my own experience, I knew who my grandparents were, and if you'd ask my parents, they could have given you a first name of my great grandparents, right? And then after that, it's just like, there in kind of there was kind of an itinerant, and like the place names all got shifted, and I'm of a Jewish heritage, and so our people didn't even get names until like 1790 or 1810 in terms of last names. So there's much more of a sort of it's not so much rootlessness exactly, though that I think there's a flavor of that, but I think that when you don't have a sense of my people have been in this place for this long amount of time, I think it's much more fertile ground for the great man, the great man history of the great man version of history to take imaginative space in your mind, because I didn't have a counterpoint. It wasn't like my people have been in Atlanta, Georgia for 500 years. I just didn't have that. So, you learn American history as if it's your own, but in some larger sense, edicts that the Russian czars were laying down in the, 1700s were much more consequential to how I got where I am. But it's for me, hearing you talk about this, I have a kind of a jealousy and also a real impressed sense of that there are people out there in our country that have this longitudinal, like long sense of being in a place with a lot of roots there.
Yeah, so it's interesting because this is probably, a point to sort of mention my personal story through this history collection really changed 12 years ago when I became an adoptive father. And so that's a whole angle of this. And sort of the experience that I had of, I am so grateful that I am one of the lucky people who has this information, whether it would be good or bad, like to know these things and to have access to this rich story is a blessing. And it's one that so many people don't have. And now that very fact is, at least, genetically, is in my own home, because I have a son. I have 2 biological children and 1 child by adoption. And now I realize that, there are parts of his story that I cannot provide to him. And I can provide him all of this. And actually, I was talking with a friend who is Black and whose family history is affected by American slavery, and who does not have the ability to herself know that kind of history. I was saying, like, one of the things I'm wrestling with is, like, I wonder, he's an infant, he can't tell me yet, but I have no idea whether this will ever be of interest to him or something that I should just sort of put to the side. And she, her point of view was, he is in your family and he owns this history now as much as all the kids in your family. So the family stories are his family stories, and you share them with him. But that, and it was an awakening to me. So it's interesting that I came up with a narrative expression that actually allowed him to be part of that story. So the way that I express that is talking about these points of departure, right? Like, so yeah, part of the story is about Johann Nicholas Bonner and all the Germans who came to one place and stayed. But the other part of Johann Nicholas's story is that he left behind a life in Germany that he never saw again, right? That he was never in Europe again. His descendants were never in Europe again. And likewise, on her side of the family, they were Mennonites. They left and came to Pennsylvania. And they left behind that whole life, and they were. So, at every point in a family, there's going to be a point of where there's a break with a past. There are going to be points of inflection where things change. And what I can offer to him is to sort of say, you are a pioneer. You, through adoption, this very loving adoption, are one of our pioneers, where I can't tell you everything that came before, but this is part of your story too. This is your family. I'm going to share these stories with you. And he will make of that what he will. All of my kids will make of their personal histories their own origin stories. If they're superheroes, this is their origin story. They'll figure out what version of it they want to keep. But also recognizing that as much as we can share the details of his own adoption, that's important for him to understand. And also, I have this rich genetic history, so he was interested, and we did do one of the genetic tests, kits, so that we could include some of his Puerto Rican heritage as part of his own story. So he can blend that in. He's going to have a very blended origin story, but that's his, and he owns all of it. And I want to support him however he wants to be supported. The most important part of the story, and a lot of these stories, is the amount of love that sustains us through these generations. To me, that is my version of this. And I'm sure that there have been unhappy marriages. I'm sure that there has been anger and brutality and suffering, some of which I may never know about, because that's the stuff that gets swept under the rug. But the part that does shine through is all these stories where I can point to that show about people making decisions to love and to share and to build a family. And that's what matters to me. And that's what I want my kids to know. Drop the mic.
Oh. Yeah.
May I? There isn't much. That was beautiful, Eric. And the one piece of follow up that I want to check in with you about is have you found that there's a different way that you talk to him about these kind of ancestors and points of departure than you do with your biological kids? And if no, have you come up with sort of all of them, they all need to know XYZ about our family history, and that has to, and have you, so I'll start there.
Well, some of what I understand about the fragility of life is that for them, a lot of what they need to know is they need to know about their father and their mother, making sure that we let them hear our stories, because that is part of our legacy. That will be what they remember, and it will also be the thing that maybe anchors them and sustains them when they are at a point in their lives where they're living without us. And so I spend more time talking about my stories, but also because both my mother and my father passed away and they didn't know them, except for my oldest, who knew them when he was a very small child, is I tell stories frequently about them. I want them to, they have a very close relationship with my wife's parents, who are a big part of their lives, and great grandparents, and love them. And they have that security of being loved by grandparents, and having them enrich their lives. But, I want to honor my mother and father by bringing them into the story and making sure that it's not just this big gap, that on that one side of the family, they don't have anything there. They're close with their uncle, my brother, again, hi, Andre. Mm-hmm. And so he's a big part of their lives. So they have a sense of my side of the family, but we've lost a lot of that connection to the extended family because of the loss of people from the older generation. And so, I share the stories when I think they're interested. Your other question was, do I talk about it differently with him? Probably I do. One of the things that certainly when it comes to the topic of adoption, I feel like that's his story to ask. And it's important for him emotionally and, developmentally for him to decide what he wants to know and when he wants to know it. So we make that history available to him, to the extent that, if he wants to ask us questions, we make sure he knows he can ask us questions, and we'll do our best to answer what we can. But the rest of the history, like they're all our kids, and if a story comes up or I want to share it, or they, I'm like the dad joke guy. I'm always the one telling them things they don't want to hear. So, I'm the one likely to spout off about a story about an ancestor that, they're like, oh, okay, Dad's talking about ancestors again. But, if they're interested, they're interested.
What's your take on, through with a bunch of our other guests, there's this ongoing conversation or struggle that's ultimately connected to the sort of who gives a shit question. But in a more specific way, it's connected to, whether I'm a great grandson of King Henry V, or, whatever, or, my great grandfather was a slave owner and clearly an abusive person. What, if anything, does that say about me and, what I pass on to my kids? Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious your take, especially having the roots that you have, having an adopted son. What's your take on the, I guess, two sides of it? Who gives a shit in general, and to what degree is this ancestral heritage meaningful?
Yeah, I've spent some time thinking about that. I don't have a good, clean answer. I do know that, part of what I shared before was the sense on the who gives a shit side is like, I kind of stopped giving a shit at some point. Like, yeah, it's interesting, and there's some interesting stuff there, but in some ways I consider it kind of curiosities. Like I'm connected to it, but what does it matter that I'm connected to it? Like it almost feels like you're trying to claim something that, it happened. I'm tangentially connected to it. So what? But I do think it matters. We don't really understand why, but we all have some kind of innate sort of like sense of who am I? Why am I here? Where do I come from? I think that's perfectly natural. And to me, and just my personal life philosophy, I think, it's sort of a riff on the same theme. It's like, what matters is the relationship and the families that we make and the choices we make, and sort of like understanding where you come from can help give you a sense of connection and love and belonging that everybody needs. An interesting fact is that so like I said, after the age of 6, I didn't have any of my biological grandparents, but I grew up my whole life calling a particular woman grandma, and my dad called her mom. Turns out she was just a retired coworker from of my dad's that they became really close, and she knew that he had grown up at Milton Hershey School for Boys, that he had grown up an orphan, and she adopted him, as an adult. She was just sort of like, you're my son now. I'm your kid's grandmom. And so, on Sundays when we were going over for lunch after church, we'd go to grandma's house, and that was just it. She wasn't German. Her last name was Labrandi. She was Italian. And, she was a real firecracker, and she was, she did not come across like the sort of stoic Lutheran Mennonite images that I had in my mind. She was really a pistol. But that was grandma to me. And so, the maid families, I'm sure, is a theme that has come up before in some of your conversations, but the maid families are part of this too. And they're just as important. And when we choose to make a new family, that's a choice. It's a place that we go and we start a new story. So history is living. We're living in it. It is what we make of it. It's told from our perspectives, right? Like, we were the ones who write our own stories, our own narratives, our own sense of self.
Well, I agree with you now. I'm not sure I think to some degree a dive in family history can give, if framed correctly, can give people that perspective that you have. I don't know that we're all so empowered as to have that perspective, but I think it's a great one to have, I would say.
Okay. at the end of the day, I think the lens that I see through this is sort of like, it's a respect for an older generation that gave to me an appreciation, a gratitude to those people, and a desire to pass that along to my kids, to make of it what they want, you know.
We had a guest on. We'll do our final reflection in a second. Before we get to the total final reflection, I do want to give you an opportunity. If there's an ancestor that you especially want to honor or talk about, just even with a brief story, or something you want to circle back to that you want to clarify. I want to give you that opportunity before we go to our final reflection point.
I don't have anything that I think I need to clarify or correct. So I'm good.
Cool. So we had a woman from a Hasidic background, a Jewish Hasidic background, on a couple of weeks ago, and she talked about in their family that when they talk about family history, it's connected to this Yiddish phrase that she used that I would butcher. But she talked about the tuchus on the table, tuchus being Yiddish for your butt, your tush. And in their family language, that meant that, like, our family history is interesting, but what's the action step? When you put your tuchus on the table, you're committing to some action step about it. And so one of the things we've been doing the last couple of these times is thinking through from the conversation if there are any tuchus on the table takeaways that we have. And Pete, I want to throw it to you. Do you, from this discussion with Eric, do you have any tuchus on the table thoughts?
I'm still, your comments, Eric, about narrating family history in terms of love is so powerful to me. And I think it makes me think of the ways I tend to narrate my own family's history through one angle or another. But that way of considering it, I found really moving and in a kind of essential way. For all kinds of reasons. And so I think that's my tuchus on the auf dem Tisch, is that how you say it?
Yeah. Auf dem Tisch, yeah.
Auf dem Tisch.
Sehr gut.
Is something like that. Like that's something I wanna think about more when I think having letters and things like that is such a big part of that, being able to see these individuals as flesh and blood. And once again, I become, with each one of these more and more passionate about the idea of preserving documents like that, digital preservation and so forth, thinking about the fact that you've come into possession of these letters and of what value they are to you. And
I should note that I have digitized a lot of this material that I have and have made it available to other people who are collecting family history, and they're putting things on the web and things like that. So I'm not trying to hoard it for myself. In fact, in some sense, if for it to live, I've got to give it away, right? Like it doesn't survive if you keep it. So
I think I love this sort of sharing economy around this knowledge, because you never know how it's going to benefit someone else. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Eric. You've moved, I think, all of us in some deep ways, and I'm grateful for you sharing what you've shared with us. And I know it's been a lifetime of work and processing and storytelling, and I'm really appreciative.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the chance to share my story and to think about it and think honestly about what am I going to do next,
One took us on the table, and I completely echo what Pete was saying, and I think to bring in the frame of love and choice into family history as often as possible can be such a foundational and wonderful gift. You know, even if I'm just framing it in my own story, you know, I think the kids would hear that and be very moved by it. The other thing that I thought is such a wonderful thing that you do, and I don't know how conscious you are of how special this is kind of crafting an intentional language around talking about your own family history, like creating that way, that using points of departure as a way to talk about it. To me, if everyone who had family history and shared it with their kids had a kind of power phrases, frames that they had thought about and were very clear about sharing with their kids, I think that would be a game changer. And I'm going to think for myself about what those might be. But I think that's really huge, and I'm very touched that you do that.
I have to say, it's not like I came upon that. I came upon that because honestly, I think I was experiencing guilt and confusion and uncertainty, and it was actually, you know, my friend Allison who, you know, sort of, you know, kind of woke me up and shook my frame a little bit. So it's not that we get to these stories without sharing them, and honestly, sometimes it's in the telling and the retelling. It's the retelling that helps you to make this discovery about them, and that's why I think it is so important to share stories. Is not just to turn this into an academic exercise. And that's fun, and I don't want people, you know, who are really into genealogy for, you know, the sort of the thrill of the hunt and the exploration of primary source documents, or, you know, reading the history. That's great. If that's what you're into, I would never criticize it at all. But if we're trying to talk about making meaning through story, we have to, it's an iterative process, right? The first telling of the story doesn't reveal everything that's embedded in that story, and you don't necessarily become conscious of everything that's contained in it. And so even just today, I'm using language I've used before, but in some ways I'm perfecting the story a little bit as well.
That could be an ongoing theme for us to think about, is the sort of the iterative process of making meaning and narrative of our family stories. This has been a total privilege and an honor to speak with you about this, Eric. Sincerely, it's a window to some stuff we haven't had a chance to talk about, and I'm so grateful.
I'm really grateful to have the conversation, and it was really nice to meet you, Pete.
Nice to meet you, Eric. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Until soon, and we'll put this up. It's on Facebook now, but we will add a title to it. And if there's any weird digital blips or bleeps or what have you, we'll try and edit them out. We'll pop it back up on Facebook next week. So you'll see it there now, but you'll see it sort of again in a slightly different format. And we'll also pop on YouTube in about a week. So you'll have that link to share too if you like.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Really, so grateful.
Good night.
Thank you, Eric.
Bye-bye.